Hello people of the internet, this is a rebuttal to a video entitled The Financial Case for Brexit by Sargon of Akkad, and I'm joined by a good friend of mine.
Hello.
And while we do not have any special insight into exactly what will happen to the UK economy should we leave the European Union, I mean very few people do, we have become increasingly frustrated by some of the fallacious arguments made by the Leave camp. So in this video we'll be addressing a number of claims made by Sargon, mostly related to the economy. So without further ado, let's see what Sargon has to say.
So let's go to the leaving will wreck the UK economy. The strongest argument I've heard from the Remain camp on leaving and the effect it's going to have is on the financial markets, and there's going to be a downturn because of the uncertainty, which is true and is already happening.
Yep.
And yes, there will be a dip in the pound if Britain leaves.
So what does a drop in the pound mean for everyday families? Well, when the pound drops, basically it costs more money to import items from other countries. So currently we import 21% of our imports from the EU are cars. So cars prices will increase. It means that when you go to exchange your pounds into euros to go on holiday in Europe, that you get less euros for your pounds. It also means that pharmaceutical products will increase in price. Currently, 8% of our imports from the EU are pharmaceutical products. So what does this mean? This means that it costs more for the NHS to deliver your care.
And I believe also mechanical appliances, we import about 12%. 12% of our import patterns are mechanical appliances as well, so they're going to become more expensive. And the other thing to keep in mind is that when you trade with other countries around the world, it's not as simple as many people like to say. Like, we have cars, the Chinese have a certain good, we trade, and everyone's happy. That's not how it works, right? When you trade in another country, you open your country's economy to that country's economy, right? So, yes, our exports will become more competitive if the pound drops, which could be a good thing for our budget surplus. And a budget surplus, by the way, is when you start to export more than you import. So you start to make net money from trading. But the problem is that the pound is unlikely to drop enough to make us competitive with the likes of China and rising powers in the East, right? Because they've specifically kept labor laws to a minimum. They have little regulation, bad working conditions. So that would mean that in order to compete with the rest of the world, we would have to drop to a much lower standard, which would obviously drop living conditions and hit ordinary families, right? And if we refuse to accept the legislation of the European Union, 94% of which non-European countries which are trading the European Union have to agree with in the first place, if we refuse to accept that legislation, which according to the Leave campaign rules our lives, then we would have to accept tariffs, making our goods even more uncompetitive. So what we see is that a drop in the pound, while certainly good for trade to a certain extent, would be bad for the economy, especially if we don't want to trade with the European Union.
Whatever it is they're doing in Europe, it doesn't seem to be working. These are the IMF's figures on economic growth. As you can see, the United States is at 2.4, the United Kingdom is at 2.9, but the Eurozone is at 0.9.
I think it's important to mention here that one of the reasons the UK economy has been growing so quickly recently is due to high population growth. For example, the UK's population growth has been 0.6%, while in Germany it's been 0.2%. So to have a like-for-like comparison between the EU economy, the German economy and the UK economy, you have to control for population growth. To do this, we're going to use per capita GDP growth. This is the growth rate of the economy spread among the population of the economy. So if we look at the figures, in 2010, Germany had higher GDP per capita growth rate than the UK. This was the case in 2011, 2012 and 2014.
And for those who are not too economically savvy, GDP stands for gross domestic product, and it's basically the total worth of all goods and services in the economy, or it can be measured as income. And while we're at it, I would like to address one quick idea, and that's it's a myth perpetuated by the Leave camp, and it's basically saying that the bureaucracy in Brussels is what's holding back Britain and the European countries from catching up in growth with the rest of the world. They see the growth in India and China, and they say it must be the bureaucracy in Brussels that's keeping us back. But actually, what they don't understand is that this is part of mainstream economic theory. In fact, most mainstream economic theory ascertains that the most advanced countries in the world who are innovating and are growing at the rate of technology will grow slower than those who are behind. And this is called capital catch-up. And basically, it's because capital, so machinery, technology, etc., which is being accumulated by poorer countries, will be at a much faster rate than those who are growing literally at the rate of technology. Because the European Union and Britain and the United States are so advanced, they are innovating new technologies, and as a result, they are growing slower than countries which are have opened up their borders and are trading with us and accumulating technology that already exists but is not being used by their country yet, which is why they're growing much faster, in addition to looser labor laws and other factors.
This is youth unemployment in Europe. Britain is down at the bottom with about 13% youth unemployment. Greece and Spain are at the top with around 50%, as well as Croatia and Italy with 30 to 40%. These are some serious problems, and something needs to change.
What Sargon neglects to mention is there are actually countries below Britain for youth unemployment. Austria, for example, at 12.6%, and Germany at 6.9%. He was using Germany as a comparison earlier, and a lot of Brexiters like to compare us with Germany. Well, here's the comparison. Germany has 6.9% youth unemployment. They have a huge amount of success with their apprenticeship schemes and getting youths to be employed.
And anyway, it's lazy analysis to suggest that the European Union has in itself caused lower unemployment rates. Clearly, since we see such variation between European countries in the European Union, you can tell that there is a certain amount of self-determination in which countries can decide for themselves the policies and the institutions that rule them, and in turn allow them to keep unemployment rates down. For example, in Canada, a non-EU country, obviously, they have 13% youth unemployment, Australia 12.2%, etc. So you can clearly see that Britain has the economic freedom within the EU to control GDP and employment rates, begging the question why we should leave in the first place. Furthermore, it's very difficult to compare countries like France, for example, because they have a different labor culture. They have more protection for families, more maternity leave, etc. So it's just lazy analysis to suggest that it's the European Union in itself that is making countries have really high youth unemployment rates.
Yeah, just to add to that, if we look at France's youth unemployment, even before Greater Political Union in 1993, there was high youth unemployment. For example, as you can see, there was 20% youth unemployment in around 1984. And although it's higher at around 26% today, you have to remember that we have just been through one of the biggest economic crashes in history.
But we could also end up with 50% youth unemployment and a negative economic growth.
Okay, now this is just lazy analysis. The United Kingdom is in the European Union, it's not in the Eurozone. As a result, it is ridiculous to suggest that the European Union in itself would cause a 50% unemployment rate or an economic downturn. Because, first of all, we're not part of the euro. So, in fact, any drop in the value of the euro would probably positively impact the pound because of people flocking to buy the pound. And furthermore, it just doesn't stack up. How exactly does us being part of the euro, when we have established that there's a variety of employment cultures, work cultures in the European Union with various unemployment rates varying from the very lowest, that's 6% of Germany, to the very highest in Greece. So why is it exactly that being a part of the European Union and remaining a part of the European Union will result in these cataclysmic unemployment rates and GDP growth rates? There is no analysis here.
And in a damning verdict on George Osborne's approach to the referendum campaign, author Dr. David Blake, a professor of pension economics at Cass Business School at City University London, accused the Treasury of becoming a propaganda machine for the EU.
So in this segment of the video, Sargon decides to quote a City University economist who has concluded that the Conservative government has been scaremongering over the economic effects of leaving the EU in an attempt to get the British public to vote out. But no analysis is brought forward to the table by Sargon. He simply quotes a lone study out of thousands available, failing to explain why this particular economist has gotten things right while every other respected economist is wrong. In fact, 9 out of 10 economists, according to a poll by Ipsos Mori, believe that Britain would be worse off if we left the European Union, including several international bodies and institutions news, yet we're not meant to take their word for it because they're part of the so-called old guard. But if we take, for example, the word of the OECD, they conclude that Britain's GDP would be worse off by 3% by 2020 if we left, costing us jobs, wealth, etc. In fact, this is backed up by the former chief economist of the IMF, who is no longer part of the so-called European elite, in air quotes, of course, Olivier Blanchard, a man that is widely respected in the economic community.
So the Treasury analysis says that the UK economy would be 6% smaller by 2013, despite the fact we are the ones growing at 2.9%, and the rest of the Eurozone, the major economies in the Eurozone, are not growing to anywhere near that amount.
Well, that just isn't true.
Would households actually be poorer if the Treasury's forecasts are right? Not really. The Treasury is estimating what the economy will look like once it has settled down after the shock of Brexit, something that might take a decade or more. During this time, the economy is likely to keep growing, but at a slower pace than it otherwise would have done. Assuming that the economy grows at 2.5% a year on average for the next 15 years inside the EU, broadly in line with its pre-2008 trend, average household incomes would rise from just over £60,000 to about £90,000 a year by 2030. So the UK Treasury is lying to us.
Okay, here's the thing. This segment of the video is more evidence of the economic illiteracy of many of the Leave campaigners than evidence of government deception. The Guardian is not calling out the Treasury directly because it knows that the Treasury isn't making the claim that ordinary families will be £4,300 poorer relative to now. They don't mean if I have £10,000 now, if we Brexit, I'll have 5,700. They are simply anticipating slower growth, which is perfectly reasonable considering that we would have to renegotiate trade agreements, would not have full access to the single market, and would no longer be in investment heaven, which we are, by the way, because we are part of the world's largest single common market, but not in the Eurozone, which has liabilities of its own, which investors want to avoid, obviously. So when the Treasury says we will be £4,300 poorer, they mean that we would have £4,300 less than we would if we had stayed in the European Union.
There are other analyses of this that suggest that British households could be almost £1,000 better off if Britain is forced to leave the European Union.
The £930 quoted is from a pro-Brexit source which is sponsored by The Telegraph, which is where the information Sargon quotes is published. The report itself admits that the figure is hard to predict, as it depends on what kind of economic and political policies are implemented by the British government. Britain's current payment to the EU is estimated at around £8.5 billion. From this figure, the report comes to the conclusion that the savings made by not having to contribute £8.5 billion to the EU budget, minus the cost of remaining part of the European Economic Area, gives the figure of £3.9 billion. This translates into a saving of £145 per household. The other savings are made up from reducing council tax bill by reducing protections for part-time workers, keeping older vehicles in service for longer, and reducing the recording of noise pollution, as well as other savings from not being part of the common fishing or agricultural policies. The report also doesn't differentiate between household savings and government savings. For households to save the same amount quoted in the report, governments would have to directly give households or cut taxes to allow the households to benefit to the same amount, to make that amount of savings. The bottom line is that in reality, it's not a likely case that households will benefit to the tune of £933. It's likely that economic uncertainty, higher unemployment would all have effects, meaning that this is reduced, and that governments use the savings elsewhere to, for example, reduce corporation tax.
Anyway, thanks for listening to our rebuttal. We should mention that since this video was largely unscripted, we were susceptible to making a few errors in speech, but all the statistics we have put forward should be correct. We would love to hear your feedback and your counterpoints to our counterpoints. We are certainly not infallible. And if you haven't made your mind up regarding which way to vote and you find the state of the economy is pivotal to your decision, we would strongly urge you to vote Remain on the 23rd. Thanks for listening, and maybe see you in the next video.